Play this piano better than I, and I shall grant you a lordship with lands." The voice of King Charles Pemberton IV thundered through the music hall of Hampton Court Palace like a decree of mockery, like a sword cutting through silk. "Play this piano better than I, and I shall grant you a lordship with lands." The words echoed again, bouncing off the walls adorned with gold leaf and portraits of long-dead monarchs who seemed to watch with cold, judging eyes. It was the night of the royal concert of 1789, and the crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling bathed the English nobility in golden splendor, casting dancing shadows that moved like ghosts across the marble floor. Under those chandeliers that sparkled like frozen stars, the cream of London society gathered in their finest. Dukes wrapped in velvet coats the color of wine, and midnight stood shoulder to shoulder with counts whose silk cravats cost more than a common family's yearly wages. Ladies adorned with diamonds that caught the candlelight, each stone worth a fortune, each necklace a legacy, laughed with mouths painted red as roses. The sound of their cruel laughter burst forth like breaking glass, echoing off the silk-lined walls that absorbed and amplified every sound, every whisper, every gasp. The air itself smelled of expensive perfume, aged brandy and power. The very atmosphere was thick with it, the weight of privilege, the scent of superiority, the taste of entitlement that these people breathed like oxygen. King Charles Pemberton IV, 32 years old, with eyes like polished steel and a jawline that could cut diamonds, stood at the center of this opulent universe like a sun demanding worship. He wore a coat of midnight blue velvet, embroidered with silver thread in patterns of vines and crowns, each button carved from ivory, each cuff trimmed with Belgian lace that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. His fingers, long and pale as winter branches, caressed the ivory keys of the grand piano as though it were his scepter, his throne, his divine right made tangible. The instrument itself was a masterpiece, imported from Vienna, its wood so polished it reflected like a black mirror, its keys made from the finest elephant ivory, its strings tuned to mathematical perfection. Around Charles, like planets orbiting their star, stood his courtiers, men and women hungry for royal favor, their eyes glittering with ambition and fear in equal measure. Lord Beaumont, with his ridiculous powdered wig and nose permanently wrinkled in disdain, clapped too loudly at every royal gesture. Lady Catherine Ashworth, draped in emeralds that matched her calculating eyes, whispered poison disguised as flattery into the king's ear. Duke Hamilton, young and foolish and desperate to be noticed, laughed at jokes that weren't funny and applauded performances that were merely adequate. They were vultures dressed in silk, parasites wearing diamonds. Charles was a virtuoso pianist, this was true. His technical skill was undeniable. Years of the finest tutors money could buy had seen to that. But he was also a notorious tyrant, a man who used his talent not to bring beauty into the world, but to crush those beneath him. Music, for Charles, was not art. It was a weapon, and tonight he intended to wield it. In the corner of the vast hall, half hidden in shadows, where the chandelier light didn't quite reach, stood Abigail Morrison. She was 31 years old, though the weight of her life made her seem both younger and older simultaneously. She carried sheets of music in her ink-stained hands, pages and pages of notations that she had copied by candlelight in her tiny room, her fingers cramping, her eyes straining night after night after night. She wore a plain brown gown, simple and unadorned, the fabric worn thin at the elbows and frayed at the hem. It had been her mother's dress once, altered and mended so many times that it was more thread than original cloth. Her hands bore the permanent stains of India ink, black half-moons beneath her fingernails, smudges on her fingertips that no amount of washing could fully remove. But those who truly looked, and almost no one did, might have noticed how those ink-stained fingers moved with an unconscious grace, as though they remembered something the rest of her tried to forget. To the glittering elite filling the hall, Abigail Morrison was invisible. She was furniture. She was a tool. She was the woman who copied their music, who transcribed their compositions, who made sure their pages were neat and their notes were legible. She was mute, disposable, less than human in their gilded eyes. They looked through her the way you look through a window, not seeing the glass, only what lies beyond it. But beneath that modest appearance, beneath that worn brown dress and those ink-stained fingers, Abigail's hands held symphonies no crown could ever buy. Her fingers remembered melodies that kings had forgotten. Her heart beat in rhythms that no amount of royal blood could replicate. Who hasn't felt this way? Invisible, disposable, less than. Perhaps you know this feeling, the sensation of being in a room full of people who act as though you don't exist. Have you ever stood in your own corner, carrying your own burden, wondering if anyone would notice your gifts? We've all experienced those moments when we feel smaller than we truly are, when the world tries to tell us our place. Abigail knew that feeling in her bones, in her blood, in every breath she took in that glittering hall. She adjusted the sheets in her arms and tried to make herself smaller, tried to become even more invisible than she already was. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. "Come forth, scribe!" King Charles Pemberton IV rose from the piano bench with theatrical flair, his coat billowing behind him like dark wings. His voice cut through the conversations, silencing 200 people in an instant. Every head turned. Every eye sought the target of the king's attention. "You there, Morrison, is it? The one who copies our music but creates nothing of her own?" Abigail's heart stopped. The sheets in her hands trembled. Around her, the nobility craned their necks to see who the king was addressing, squinting into the shadows where she stood. When they finally spotted her, this plain woman in her plain dress, their faces twisted with cruel amusement. "Yes, you!" Charles pointed directly at her, his finger like a loaded pistol. "Step forward into the light so everyone can see the woman who believes she understands music simply because she can copy it onto paper." The crowd roared with laughter. Bishop Aldridge, his jowls shaking with mirth, shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, "A woman's fingers are too weak for such mastery, their minds too simple for true artistry." More laughter. More cruel, cutting, vicious laughter that sliced through Abigail like knives. Lady Catherine Ashworth lifted her fan to hide her smile, but made sure her voice carried, "Perhaps she can play Mary Had a Little Lamb for us." The hall exploded with mockery. "I wager she's never even touched a piano," Lord Beaumont declared, his wig tilting comically as he shook with laughter. "Probably thinks the keys are made of actual ivory elephants. Women should stick to embroidery," Duke Hamilton added, slapping his knee. "Their fingers are meant for needles, not keyboards." The laughter grew louder, meaner, more vicious. It was the sound of people who had never known hunger, never known struggle, never known what it meant to be looked through rather than looked at. It was the sound of cruelty wearing the mask of entertainment. "Come now, don't be shy." Charles beckoned, his smile sharp as broken glass. "I have a proposition for you, dear scribe, an opportunity you could never dream of earning on your own merit." Abigail's feet moved before her mind could stop them. She walked forward, each step feeling like walking through deep water, her heart pounding so loud she was certain everyone could hear it. The crowd parted to let her through, their faces twisted in anticipation of a spectacle. She could feel their eyes on her like brands burning her skin. She could smell their expensive perfumes mixing with the scent of her own fear sweat. She could taste copper in her mouth, the taste of biting the inside of her cheek to keep from crying. When she finally stood before the king, the piano looming beside them like a sleeping dragon, Charles looked down at her with eyes that held no warmth, no humanity, only cold amusement. "Here is my challenge," he announced to the entire room, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. This piano, this magnificent instrument, holds the most difficult piece ever written, Mozart's Sonata in D major, the piece that even the masters of Vienna struggled to perfect. It requires not just technical skill, but soul, passion, understanding. He paused dramatically, letting the tension build. If you, dear scribe, can play this piece better than I have just performed it, if you can surpass the King of England himself in musical prowess, then I shall grant you something extraordinary. The room held its breath. I shall make you Lady Morrison, a lordship with lands, estates, titles, wealth beyond your wildest imagination. He smiled, and it was the smile of a cat playing with a mouse. But when you fail, as you surely will, you shall be banished from this court forever. You'll never touch another piece of music, never enter these halls, never again pretend to understand an art form that is clearly beyond your simple comprehension. The crowd murmured with excitement. Lord Beaumont pulled out a small notebook and began taking bets. £10, says she runs from the room in tears. Lady Ashworth wagered a diamond bracelet that Abigail would faint before reaching the piano bench. Duke Hamilton bet his prize stallion that she wouldn't be able to play a single note correctly. The cruelty was casual, thoughtless, as natural to them as breathing. Abigail stood there, the weight of 200 gazes pressing down on her shoulders like stones. The piano waited, its black surface reflecting the chandelier light like dark water. Something flickered in her eyes then. A recognition, a memory, a spark that the nobles were too distracted to notice. Her fingers flexed almost imperceptibly, as though greeting an old friend. Her hands trembled. Her throat felt tight. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee, to escape this humiliation before it could become complete. Tell us, have you ever faced a moment where everything depended on your next choice? A moment when the world watched, waiting for you to fail, but then, like a whisper carried on wind that no longer blew, she heard it, her father's voice. Maestro William Morrison, once the most celebrated composer in all of England, reduced to poverty by the very nobles who now laughed at his daughter. Play with your heart, my darling. They may steal our estate, but never our music. Abigail closed her eyes. Suddenly, she was no longer in Hampton Court Palace. In that moment, memory and present collided in a way that would give her the strength to do the impossible. She was 10 years old again, sitting on a wooden stool in their small cottage in the countryside, before the debts, before the shame, before everything fell apart. The room smelled of wood smoke and her mother's lavender soap. Weak sunlight filtered through windows that needed washing, casting golden squares on the worn wooden floor. Her father sat beside her at their old upright piano, not grand like the king's, but honest, solid, well-loved. His hands, already showing the tremor of the illness that would eventually take him, guided her small fingers across the keys. "Music is not in the fingers, Abigail," he whispered, his voice warm as summer honey. "It's in the heart, it's in the soul. When you play, don't think about who's listening. Don't play to impress. Don't play to win. Play for the ones who loved you. Play for the moments that mattered. Play for the truth that lives in here." He placed his hand over her heart. "This is where real music comes from. And no amount of royal blood, no title, no crown can create what lives in a heart that has truly loved and truly suffered." "But Papa," young Abigail had asked, her voice small and uncertain, "what if I'm not good enough? What if I fail?" Her father had smiled then, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "My darling girl, you are already enough, more than enough. You are my daughter. You carry our family's gift. When the world tries to silence you, when powerful people try to make you small, remember this. They fear what they cannot understand, and they cannot understand the music that comes from a heart that has known true love." He had played then, his trembling fingers still finding the notes, still creating beauty despite the illness ravaging his body. Abigail had watched, memorizing every movement, every touch, every breath. She hadn't known that these were his final lessons, that within months he would be gone, that the estate would be seized, that she and her mother would be left with nothing but memories and music. A sound brought her back, the shattering of a champagne glass against marble, the crystal fragments scattered like stars. Abigail opened her eyes, the hall, the lights, the cruel faces, but something had changed inside her. What the king and his courtiers didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was about to shatter their entire world. The fear was still there, but it was no longer alone. Alongside it burned something else: defiance, purpose. A debt owed to a father who died believing his daughter could be extraordinary. She looked up at King Charles Pemberton IV, this man who used music as a weapon, who wore his talent like armor, who had never known what it meant to lose everything and still find reasons to create beauty. "I accept your Majesty's challenge." The words fell into absolute silence. For 3 full heartbeats, no one moved, no one breathed. The impossibility of what she had just said hung in the air like smoke. Then the hall erupted, not in applause but in shock, in disbelief, in anticipation of a spectacular humiliation. This was going to be entertaining. This was going to be a story they told at parties for years to come. The scribe who thought she could outplay the king. The woman who reached so far above her station that her fall would be legendary. Charles's smile widened. "Excellent. Then let us begin." He gestured to the piano bench with mock gallantry. "The stage is yours, Lady Morrison that will never be." The crowd pressed closer, forming a semicircle around the piano. Abigail walked to the bench, her worn shoes silent on the marble. With each step toward the piano bench, something shifted in her posture, subtle, almost invisible, but there. The servant was fading. Something else was emerging. She sat, adjusting her brown skirt, so plain against the instrument's glossy black surface. She placed her hands above the keys, not touching them yet, just hovering, remembering. The sheets in her hands trembled, yes, but not only from fear. There was something else in that tremor, something that knew the weight of expectation, the burden of legacy, the power of music passed from teacher to student across years of patient love. If you've also felt like you had one chance, just one single moment, to prove that you were more than people believed you to be, then you understand what Abigail felt in that moment. Perhaps you've sat at your own metaphorical piano, with your own audience of doubters surrounding you, wondering if you had the courage to try, wondering if you had the strength to risk failure for the possibility of vindication. If this story has moved you so far, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from, and leave your like to keep bringing stories that touch the heart. Your interaction helps us continue creating content that inspires. Abigail touched the keys. The ivory was cool under her fingertips, smooth as river stones, familiar as her own skin. There was no hesitation in that first touch. None of the fumbling one might expect from someone who only copies music. Her hands knew these keys the way a bird knows the sky. She took a breath deep and full and steadying and began to play. What emerged from the piano in the next seconds would silence a kingdom. The first note rang out pure and clear as a bell. The second followed, precise as mathematics, beautiful as poetry. By the third note, the laughter had begun to die. By the 10th, the room had fallen completely silent. By the 20th, something impossible was happening. Abigail's fingers didn't merely strike the keys. They danced across them. They sang. They wept. They told stories in a language that had no words but spoke directly to the soul. Every chord was perfection, not the cold, technical perfection of a well-trained performer, but the warm, living perfection of someone who understood that music was not about the notes, but about what lived between them. King Charles had played with precision. Abigail played with passion, Charles had demonstrated skill, Abigail demonstrated soul. Charles had shown what money could buy. Abigail showed what no amount of wealth could ever purchase. The Mozart Sonata in D major is not merely difficult, it is a test of character. The piece demands that the performer navigate complex runs and intricate passages, yes, but more than that, it demands vulnerability. It requires the musician to open their heart and let the audience see inside. Charles, for all his training, had never learned this. He played to dominate. Abigail played to share. Abigail. As she moved through the first movement, her fingers flying across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for human hands, the nobles who had been laughing began to change. Lord Beaumont's mocking smile faded. Lady Ashworth's hand, raised to make another cruel comment, slowly lowered. Duke Hamilton stopped mid-laugh, the sound dying in his throat. Bishop Aldridge closed his eyes, and a single tear rolled down his wrinkled cheek. The music swelled, filling every corner of the vast hall. Join us in witnessing this moment of transformation, when truth finally overcomes prejudice. It climbed up to the painted ceiling where angels and cherubs looked down with eternal smiles. It sank into the marble floor where the feet of kings and queens had walked for centuries. It wrapped around each listener like a gentle embrace, like a mother's touch, like a father's final lesson. Abigail entered the second movement, the Adagio, the heart of the piece. This is where Mozart demanded everything. No hiding behind speed or technical flourishes. Just raw, honest emotion translated into sound. Her hands slowed, each note given space to breathe, to exist, to matter. The melody was heartbreak made audible. It was loss and love intertwined. It was her father's final days, played out in major and minor keys. Have you ever cried at a piece of music? Have you felt art break through your defenses and touch something deep inside? Perhaps you've witnessed someone close to you finally show the world what they're truly capable of. That moment of revelation when the invisible becomes unmistakable. The Queen Mother, 83 years old and hardened by decades of court politics, felt something crack in her chest. She hadn't cried in 40 years. Tonight, tears streamed down her powdered face, cutting tracks through her makeup. She didn't wipe them away. Neither did the Duchess beside her, or the Count behind her, or the Earl across the room. The music had ceased to be a performance. It had become a confession, a prayer, a revelation. How many of us hide talents, stories, pain? How many become invisible just to survive? Abigail had hidden hers for years, transcribing other people's music while her own gift lay dormant. But tonight, this one night, that gift had awakened. She transitioned into the third movement, and here was where genius revealed itself. And this was only the beginning of what she had to show them. The triple variations, a section so technically demanding that even the masters of Vienna could only execute it with painstaking concentration, flowed from her fingers like water from a fountain. Left hand and right hand carried on separate conversations that somehow created a unified story. The melodies split and recombined, danced apart and came together, created patterns so complex they seemed mathematically impossible, and yet so natural they felt inevitable. King Charles Pemberton IV, still standing beside the piano, watched with an expression that had never crossed his face before, genuine shock. His mouth hung slightly open. His hands, which had been so confident on these very keys just minutes before, hung limp at his sides. He was watching his superiority crumble, note by perfect note. The music built toward the crescendo, the final passage where the piece demanded everything the performer had left to give. Abigail's whole body moved with the sound now. Her shoulders swayed, her torso curved and straightened. She was no longer playing the piano. She had become the piano. The instrument was an extension of her body, her soul, her father's legacy flowing through her fingers into sound. The crescendo came like a wave crashing against rocks, powerful, overwhelming, inevitable. The notes piled on top of each other, creating a wall of sound that was somehow both thunderous and delicate. Her hands blurred across the keys, executing passages that should have been impossible, that Charles himself couldn't perform without mistakes. But Abigail made no mistakes. Not one. Not a single note out of place. Not a single moment of hesitation. And then, the final chord. Both hands came down together, fingers spread across the keys in a formation that encompassed almost 2 full octaves. The sound rang out, pure and true and final. It hung in the air like the last bell of evening, like a door closing, like an ending that was also a beginning. Abigail lifted her hands from the keys. The piano fell silent. The hall fell silent. The entire universe seemed to hold its breath. 1 second passed, 2, 3. Then the Queen Mother rose to her feet, her ancient joints protesting, but her spirit insistent. Her hands came together in applause, slow at first, then faster, then thunderous. The sound of her clapping was like a spell breaking. One by one, then in groups, then in a flood, the entire English court erupted to their feet. The applause was deafening. It shook the chandeliers. It made the paintings rattle against the walls. It was the sound of 200 noble hearts recognizing something they couldn't deny, couldn't diminish, couldn't dismiss. Genius. Not the purchased, trained, cultivated genius of the wealthy, but the raw, authentic, undeniable genius of someone who was born to music the way fish are born to water. Lord Beaumont was applauding so hard his ridiculous wig slipped sideways. Lady Ashworth clutched her emeralds with one hand while clapping with the other, her face stunned. Duke Hamilton shouted, "Brava! Brava!" until his voice went hoarse. Bishop Aldridge wept openly, his hands pressed together in something that was part applause, part prayer. If this performance has touched your heart, share this story with someone who needs to remember that true talent cannot be hidden. Comment below if you've ever been underestimated. Your story might inspire others. Your engagement helps us continue bringing stories that move and inspire people around the world. The applause continued for 5 full minutes. Some in the crowd began to chant, "Morrison, Morrison, Morrison." It was not the king they were cheering. It was the transcriber. It was the woman in the worn brown dress. It was the one they had mocked, the one they had dismissed, the one they had rendered invisible. King Charles Pemberton IV stood frozen beside the piano, his face cycling through emotions faster than thoughts. Shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, buried deep but unmistakable, shame. His courtiers, those vultures in silk, those parasites in diamonds, no longer looked at him. Every eye in the room was on Abigail. Finally, the applause began to fade. Abigail stood from the piano bench, her legs shaking, her heart racing. She had done it. She had actually done it. But as the crowd's cheers continued to echo, she felt strangely empty. This wasn't what her father had taught her to seek. This wasn't why he had given her music. The king cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. "Well," he said, his voice tight as a wire, "it seems, that is to say," he couldn't finish. The words wouldn't come. How do you acknowledge your own defeat? How do you admit that everything you believed about yourself was a lie? Lord Chancellor Wentworth, a man of law and tradition, stepped forward. He was old, respected, honest in a court built on deception. "Your Majesty," he said loudly enough for all to hear, "you made a promise before these witnesses. The terms were clear. Miss Morrison has not merely met your challenge, she has surpassed it. You must honor your word." The crowd murmured in agreement. Heads nodded. Even the king's closest supporters couldn't deny what they had witnessed. Charles's face flushed red, then pale, then red again. He looked at the piano, at Abigail, at the crowd, anywhere but at the truth staring him in the face. "Yes," he finally managed. Yes, of course. I am a man of my word. He turned to Abigail, and the smile he forced onto his face looked like it was causing him physical pain. Miss Morrison, as promised, I hereby grant you the title of Lady Morrison, with lands and estates befitting your new station. You shall have the Thornbury Manor and its surrounding properties. You shall have an annual income. You shall have, he said. Abigail looked up at him, this man who had tried to humiliate her, this king who had used his power as a cudgel. Keep your lordship, your majesty. Keep your estates and your titles and your wealth. Shock rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Refuse a lordship, refuse lands, refuse everything the king had offered? What kind of madness was this? But Abigail's voice was steady, stronger than it had ever been. My father, Maestro William Morrison, taught me that true nobility lies not in titles granted by other men, but in the art we create, in the truth we speak, in the dignity we maintain, even when the world tries to strip it from us. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small, worn daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. She held it up so the crowd could see. A man with kind eyes and gentle hands, seated at a piano, looking at the camera with patient love. This is my father. Perhaps some of you remember him, Maestro William Morrison, who wrote the compositions that once filled these very halls with beauty, who taught nobility and common folk alike because he believed music belonged to everyone, who was ruined by false debts and broken promises, who died in poverty because he refused to compromise his art for those who valued gold more than grace. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some faces showed recognition, some showed guilt. The truth they were about to learn would shame them all. The wheels of aristocratic memory began to turn, connecting this woman standing before them to the composer who had once been their darling, before they destroyed him for sport. I am already noble, Abigail continued, her voice rising not in volume, but in power. I am noble through my music. I am noble through my father's legacy. I'm noble through every note I've transcribed, every composition I've preserved, every melody I've carried forward when easier paths beckoned. Your titles and lands cannot give me what I already possess. They cannot make me more than what my father's love and teaching already made me. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been told you weren't good enough, you understand what Abigail felt in that moment. Do you believe that our loved ones watch over us, that their teachings live on through our actions? She turned to address not just the king, but the entire assembly. For years I've been invisible to you. You looked through me as though I were glass. You treated me as furniture, as tools, as less than human. And yet all that time I carried inside me what you've spent fortunes trying to buy. The ability to create real beauty. Not beauty that impresses, but beauty that transforms. Not music that dominates, but music that heals. We've all faced a defining moment. That instant when we must choose between accepting humiliation or defending our dignity. As we follow this journey together, we understand that these stories aren't just about the past. They're about all of us. Abigail had found hers at a piano bench, and she had chosen to defend not just herself, but every person who had ever been rendered invisible by power and privilege. Lady Ashworth spoke up, her voice smaller than before. But surely you want something, recognition, compensation for the injustice done to your family. Abigail looked at her, and there was no anger in her gaze, only clarity. I want you to remember tonight. I want you to remember that the woman you didn't see, the transcriber you dismissed, the soul you treated as invisible, she could outplay your king. I want you to wonder who else you're not seeing. How many other people with extraordinary gifts are rendered invisible by your assumptions about what talent looks like, where it comes from, who deserves to be heard. She placed the daguerreotype back in her pocket, over her heart. My father can rest now. His music didn't die with him. His student, his daughter, stands in the most powerful court in England and proves that what he taught was true. Real art cannot be purchased, only earned through love, suffering, and truth. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the silence of shock or the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of people confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves. Some looked at the floor. Others stared at their expensive clothing and jewels as though seeing them for the first time. A few, like the Queen Mother, like Bishop Aldridge, like Lord Chancellor Wentworth, looked at Abigail with something that resembled respect. King Charles Pemberton IV stood diminished, not in height or physical presence, but in the way that matters most, in character. He had sought to humiliate someone he considered beneath him, and instead he had revealed his own smallness. He had used music as a weapon and been defeated by someone who understood music as truth. "You may go," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. Abigail curtsied, not in submission, but as a formality, an acknowledgement that rituals must be observed even when they've lost their meaning. She turned and walked back through the crowd. This time, they parted not with cruel anticipation, but with something approaching reverence. But what she would say next would echo through history. Some reached out as though to touch her dress as she passed, as though proximity to her might grant them something they lacked. She retrieved her sheets of music from where she had left them in the shadows. The pages were still there, still ink on paper, still the work of her hands. She would continue to transcribe, to preserve, to serve, but she would never again be invisible. She would never again be less than. Because tonight, for one perfect performance, she had shown them what true nobility looked like. As she reached the doors of the music hall, ready to step out into the night where she belonged, a voice called out, "Miss Morrison." She turned. It was the Queen Mother, making her slow way through the crowd with the aid of a cane carved from ivory. The crowd parted for her. When she reached Abigail, she took the younger woman's hands in her own, wrinkled and spotted with age, but surprisingly strong. "Your father would be very proud," the Queen Mother said softly, so only Abigail could hear. "I remember him, you know. I remember his music, and I remember how we failed him, how we let lesser men destroy a greater soul. I cannot undo what was done. But I can tell you this, you have done what few ever manage. You have taken your inheritance, not of lands or gold, but of love and art, and you have made it into something the world cannot ignore. You have honored him in a way that matters more than any estate ever could." Tears came to Abigail's eyes then, the first since her father's death. Not tears of sorrow, but of release, of completion, of a debt paid. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she whispered. The Queen Mother squeezed her hands once, then released them. Abigail curtsied again, deeper this time with genuine respect. Then she turned and walked through the doors, into the cool London night, carrying her sheets of music and her father's memory. Outside, the London night was cool and clear, stars visible above the palace spires, despite the city's glow. Abigail paused at the top of the marble steps, breathing in air that no longer felt heavy with judgment. In the distance, she could hear the Thames, eternal and indifferent to the dramas of nobles and kings. She looked down at her worn brown dress, at her ink-stained hands, and smiled. Nothing had changed about her appearance. She was still the transcriber, still the woman in simple clothes, still carrying sheets of music that needed to be organized and filed. But everything had changed. A carriage rolled past, some earl or duke leaving early, unable to face the evening after what they'd witnessed. The driver tipped his hat to her. A simple gesture, but one that never would have happened before tonight. Respect, she realized, changes everything without changing anything. Abigail descended the steps slowly, savoring each one. Tomorrow, she would return to her small room, to her candles and her ink. She would continue transcribing, continue serving, continue being invisible to most. But she would never again be invisible to herself. And perhaps that was the only audience that truly mattered. Behind her, in the glittering hall, the story had already begun to spread. Within days, it would be told in every drawing room in London. Within weeks, it would be in every newspaper. Within months, it would become legend. The transcriber who outplayed the king, the invisible woman who became unforgettable, the daughter who honored her father's legacy by refusing to trade it for empty titles. If you made it this far, perhaps it's because you also believe every person has worth, regardless of their social position. Together, we carry these stories forward. Together, we remember that every person has value. This community exists because we believe in lifting each other up, because we recognize that the most powerful stories aren't always about kings and queens in their palaces, but about ordinary people who choose to be extraordinary. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for seeing value in stories that matter. Leave your comment below telling us what spoke to you most. Was it Abigail's courage, her father's wisdom, or the moment the crowd finally recognized true talent? And if you'd like to support us further, consider clicking the Super Thanks button. Your generosity helps us bring more stories like this one to life. The story of Abigail Morrison and the piano that silenced a king became eternal legend, engraved not just in bronze or stone, but in the hearts of everyone who heard it. It became a reminder that royal arrogance always bows before true talent, that those who seek to humiliate others only reveal their own emptiness, that crowns can be purchased or inherited, but souls, real, genuine, beautiful souls, can only be forged through love, loss, and the courage to create beauty even when the world insists you have nothing to offer. Years later, long after King Charles Pemberton IV was forgotten, long after his courtiers had faded into history, people still told the story of the woman in the brown dress who played piano with her father's hands and her own unbreakable heart. They told it to their children, who told it to their children, who told it to theirs, and in each telling the message remained the same. And somewhere, someone who loved you is watching with pride as you prove that dignity cannot be granted by others, only claimed by yourself. This is not just Abigail's story, it's a reminder for all of us, for you reading this now, wherever you are, whatever makes you feel small in a world that often celebrates only the loud and the powerful. Your worth is not determined by who sees you. It's determined by what you carry inside. And when your moment comes, when your piano bench appears and your audience gathers, may you have the courage that Abigail had. The courage to play not for applause or approval, but for the love that taught you, the truth that sustains you, and the art that makes you more than any title ever could. Play with your heart, as Maestro William Morrison once taught his daughter, because they may steal estates, they may grant or deny lordships, they may render you invisible in their glittering halls, but they can never, never steal your music. That belongs to you alone, forever undiminished, forever noble, forever true.